Let's go to the next slide, please. And here's about Alexander Hamilton. In June of 1783, Hamilton, in resolutions for a new Constitution of the United States of America, set forth explicitly, now again, this comes right out of the pen of Alexander Hamilton, quote, to emit an unfunded paper as the sign of value ought not to continue a formal part of the Constitution. In other words, he was rejecting paper money for the Constitution, nor ever hereafter to be employed, being in its nature pregnant with abuses, and liable to be made the engine of imposition and fraud, holding out temptations equally pernicious to the integrity of government and to the morals of the people. Come back to me, please. I mean, how clear could Hamilton possibly be? Liable to be made the engine of imposition and fraud. And that's what you've been hearing about from me for the last 3 years, how our monetary system has really defrauded ordinary people. And in effect, it works to transfer the real wealth of society from the people who earn it, people like yourselves watching this show, to the people who create the money and move it around. That's the Wall Street crowd. And so even though Hamilton condemned this in no uncertain terms, let's go to the next slide, please. And here we see the $10 bill with Alexander Hamilton's picture on it. Talk about causing a false impression. Again, this violates Jewish law. So Hamilton, were he alive, were any of these guys alive today, Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, none of these founders would countenance putting their money on paper money. Come back to me, please. Well, how is it that paper money gets to circulate at all? I mean, why would anyone take a piece of paper in exchange for their goods and services? Well, the way it gets to circulate is through coercion. And the coercion is called legal tender. Now, I want to talk more about this in just a moment. But first I want to tell you, or show you rather, what Thomas Paine, another one of the founders of our country, had to say about legal tender. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this comes right from the pen of Thomas Paine. This is the fellow who wrote Common Sense, and he was one of the principal proponents of the Revolution. And says Thomas Paine, quote, "The laws of a country ought to be the standard of equity, i.e. fairness, and calculated to impress on the minds of the people the moral as well as the legal obligations of political justice. But tender laws of any kind operate to destroy morality and to dissolve by the pretense of law what ought to be the principle of law to support reciprocal justice between man and man," and here comes the key phrase, "and the punishment of a member," she's talking about a member of Congress, "who should move for such a law ought to be death." Come back to me, please. Now, how strong could Thomas Paine have ever been? Talks about paper money operating to destroy morality, to destroy the pretense of law. Excuse me, he's talking about legal tender, not paper money. Legal tender, to operate to destroy morality. In other words, to force people to accept a piece of paper gussied up with signatures and seals for their goods and services, to dissolve by the pretense of law what ought to be a principle of law, and to support reciprocal justice between man and man. And he calls for the death penalty for anyone who should propose legal tender. And let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this little phrase, this appears on every bill that you have in your pocket. So you pull out any money that you have, and in the upper left-hand side, it says, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable and lawful money at the United States Treasury." Actually, these days, that lawful money stuff isn't there. This is an older one. Come back to me, please. So now all of our paper money has become legal tender, something which Jefferson denied. You'll recall he says there is no legal tender power for the government, and yet Thomas Paine saying anybody who proposed that ought to be put to death. Talk about a false impression. So again, this violates Genevus Das. This violates the commandment in Jewish law not to create a false impression in the minds of the people. So the notion that they represent to you on all of the bills that somehow the founders, somehow this is in accordance with the wishes of the people who founded this country, and somehow in accordance with the Constitution, when in fact James Madison, who was the principal author of the Constitution, said it was unconstitutional. I mean, what's going on here, folks? I mean, how do you have this kind of deception? And again, this deception violates Jewish law. Now, the way we got to legal tender, by the way, in the United States, mindful that the founders were against it, that it wasn't provided for in the Constitution. It really came about as a result of something that happened during the Civil War. The Civil War, as you may know, was a very unpopular war. Lincoln had trouble financing it. They had raised the tariff to something called to 47%. It was called the Morrill Tariff. Didn't bring enough money. They instituted an income tax. People rejected it. And it turned out they couldn't borrow the money because it would have popped interest rates to maybe 10, 12%. In those days, the banks' portfolios were full of bonds. If interest rates had gone up, the value of those bonds would have gone way down. The banks would have been bankrupt. So if you can't tax it, you can't borrow it, well, what do? And the answer is you just print it. Well, why would anyone accept printed money? And the guy who solved this problem was Lincoln's very brilliant Secretary of the Treasury. His name was Salmon Chase. He said, well, we'll make it legal tender. Now, again, there is no legal tender power for paper money in the Constitution. In fact, the federal government, general government, does not even have the power to issue paper money. Forget about whether it's backed by redeemable, exchangeable, or anything for gold. They're not allowed to use paper money. And so in Article 1, Section 8, they give the government the power to coin money, And then in Article 1, Section 10, they say the states must make a payment only in gold and silver and can make a legal tender only out of gold and silver. But again, legal tender out of gold and silver is redundant because people accept gold and silver anyway. So there is no power in the Constitution for legal tender from the federal government, and there is certainly no power in the Constitution for issuing paper money. So again, they had this problem during the Civil War. So Chase issues this paper money. Is called greenbacks because the backs of the bills were in green, and to make them circulate, he made them legal tender. And this caused a great deal of controversy at the time. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of litigation. And after the Civil War, Salmon Chase had become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and what do you know, a lot of this litigation percolated up to him. And one of the first cases, they came to him on the legal tender, and now he really spoke the truth. He said, there is no legal tender power in the Constitution. He said, we did it during the Civil War as a war measure, out of necessity. And so the notion was if they didn't create a legal tender money, then they couldn't have financed the Civil War, and they would have lost the Union. And so now he said that the Civil War is over. He said now there's no necessity at all for legal tender, and it's illegal, and that was that. But then something very bad happened. There were 2 vacancies on the Supreme Court, and Grant filled them with 2 railroad attorneys. The railroads owed a lot of money, and they wanted legal tender so they could discharge their debts. Again, cheating people. And the next case that came before the court was called the Knox versus Lee decision, and now Salmon Chase, as the Chief Justice, was outvoted, and they said legal tender is okay. But Chase had the last word. He said legal tender is necessary, in a written opinion. He said, and this is a direct quote, he said legal tender is necessary only for the purpose of dishonesty from the sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. So again, I don't have the image with me, but now Salmon Chase's picture also appears on one of our paper money notes, and again it's a legal tender note, again creating a false impression, and again this violates Jewish law. Now I'm going to have a lot more to say about how the monetary system violates Jewish law, but today all I wanted to do was just show you the pictorial and written evidence that the founders spoke against it, and in fact today the people who put this in place are really creating a false impression, an out-and-out lie, in effect to cheat people. We're right at the end. I want to thank you for watching the Larry Park Show. It's a real been an honor and a pleasure to present to you. I hope you'll tune in again next week. Thank you very much. Good night.